It's a huge camera. I mean, I got like 3 in my hands.
Alright, you can stop rolling. What's good? Welcome back to the channel. So as you saw, I got to play with that giant Fuji GX617 camera. 617 refers to that giant negative that the camera produces. And it's massive. Honestly, it's bigger than anything I've ever really seen within the medium format, you know, shooting on 120 film. Of course, 4x5 and 8x10, those things are obviously bigger, but this camera is not any of that. This camera is a medium format camera that shoots on 120 film. So getting these giant 6x17 negatives gives you that really wide panorama aspect ratio. And you know, we can kind of compare here. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a 6x9. And you know, it's a big negative. You can see kind of right there the width. You know, that's about 2.5 inches, just rounding, or 2 inches, let's say. On a 6x17 negative, you can see how big these negatives are. Just look at that compared to my face. It's about the width of my face, maybe a little bit less because of the beard, but you already know, it's massive. That's probably a good 5 inches, maybe 4 or 5 inches. I don't know, something like that in terms of width. So it's just massive. Why would you shoot something like that? Well, the main reason people do it is for panoramas. So typically you'd find this in landscape or cityscape photography. In my example, obviously we did cityscape and we climbed up to the top of the rock. We didn't climb, we took the elevator, but we went up to the top of the rock and got some incredible panorama views of the New York City skyline facing south. This camera can be used, of course, in those situations, but also outdoors, kind of in the woods, in the countryside, in the mountains, things like that. And you're bound to get some incredible compositions. You don't need a camera like that in order to create, you know, beautiful cityscape, landscape images. You can use any camera. And in fact, I brought this 6x9 camera with me, the Zeiss Icon Netter. This is one of the super early models. I think based on the serial number, this thing dates back to the 40s. So, you know, you can use a camera like that. You can use your iPhone. You can use anything. But, you know, we're all film nerds here. So playing with a camera like the GX617 is a lot of fun. And making those big negatives was definitely a challenge. Real quick, let's do a nice walkthrough of this camera because there's a lot to see here. So this camera obviously is enormous, and that's because it makes the 6x17 negative. And there's a couple of things to look at on the camera. So first and foremost is the actual body. And the camera body itself has to be big and wide to accommodate the image size. Because of course you want your negative to be exposed in that giant 6x17 ratio, and therefore the camera has to be big. There's no way around it. But beyond that, there's not really much going on. This is basically a box, you know, just like most cameras, a box that's dark inside. There are a couple controls here. You obviously have a shutter button where you can kind of screw in your shutter release as well. And you have a switch which lets you toggle between 4 exposures on 120 film or 8 exposures on 220 film. But that's about it. There's really not too much going on here. The camera does recognize the film and has some internal controls, so you can't like freely shoot this camera. It functions in an exact way, and you know, it won't even let you release the shutter if there's no film inside the camera. The thing that catches everyone's eye is of course the lens. This lens is massive, and there's a huge cage built around it, as you can see. There's 3 different lenses in the camera lineup. I think it's 3, maybe there's another one, but I think it's 3. And in full frame equivalent, they're basically a 20mm, a 24mm, and then something like a 42. So this one right here is the 180mm lens, and this in full frame equivalent is kind of like a 42. So I chose this lens specifically because I didn't want to have a ridiculously wide panorama. I wanted something slightly tighter, but obviously still panoramic. And no regrets at all. This gave me the exact look I wanted. All of the controls are on the lens, as you can see. You've got your focusing, you've got your shutter speed selection, and you've got your aperture control. On top of that, you do have that shutter cocking mechanism. And that's very important. If you don't do that, the camera will not fire, but you'll still be able to press the shutter button on the camera itself. So you think you got a photo, but you actually don't. And to make it even more challenging, when you cock that shutter, it's just a very faint kind of like mechanism. Therefore, it's hard to tell that you've actually cocked it appropriately. Unlike 4x5 cameras, for example, where when you cock the lens, that lever that you pull usually stays in the position until you actually release and open the lens. So just a bit tricky, but something to be aware of. Last thing to mention is that this camera does not have an actual viewfinder. There is a viewfinder that you put on top of the camera that kind of lets you see basically what it is that you're getting in frame, but it's not the exact image. So basically with this camera, you're composing with this external viewfinder, which you see at the top there. And the view's pretty cool when you look through it. It looks kind of high tech, and it has a really nice kind of brightness on the inside. But the most important thing about this camera when composing is that level. and that's what you see there to the left of the viewfinder. That level ensures that your image is straight, and that's important with panoramic cameras because they're so wide that if you're not straight, you're gonna get crazy distortion. So when I actually took the photos at the top of the rock, I didn't even use the viewfinder because I knew that the view was gonna be basically the same no matter what. There was one composition that I wanted, and that was straight on. But what I did do is look directly at the level the entire time. And I did not press the shutter button until I saw that the bubble level was strictly in the middle. And it worked great. I didn't have any distortion in my images. Maybe my composition was slightly crooked, but it didn't affect the actual straight lines in the image. So things worked very well. But with this camera, it's a very different shooting experience. You're not using this like any other camera, really. You're basically zone focusing, and you're also basically composing by feel, or at best with the viewfinder. Let's jump into the footage from the day when I went up there to take these photos. So I was just seated here chilling, waiting for my homie Brian to show up, and I noticed that the view in front of me was pretty dope. So I pulled out the Zeiss Icon Netter and I just started taking a couple pics. What's up?
You have it on video?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's the only mode. So we're running a bit early, and we decided to go hit a brewery nearby just to get a drink or two. And honestly, I think we had more than just a drink or two. Probably not the best idea, but whatever. Brian, how many beers did you have?
I prefer not to answer that question.
So to get to the top of the rock, they force you to go through this whole kind of initial phase at the bottom of the building. And it includes these super cheesy tourist photos where you basically sit on a fake beam and pretend you're up on the construction zone of the Empire State Building or something. Top of the rock has about 66 floors, I believe, something like that, give or take. And there's a couple different viewing decks up at the top. So you basically hop in an elevator down in the mezzanine level and you go straight all the way to the top.
Yes, like I said, it's the sunset hours, it's beautiful out. There's no time limit on how long you have to be here. You can stay with us all night if you want. We close at 11, all right? So enjoy yourself. Take a lot of pictures and soak in the moment. You can now enter. Thank you. You're welcome. 67, 43-second ride to the top. Enjoy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to Top of the Rock.
If you're ever in New York City, you have to come to Top of the Rock. The views are ridiculous, and the moment you get out of the elevator and you catch a glimpse through a window or just into the main area, instantly it's just a dumbfounding view. You feel tiny, and you can see this incredible, not only the New York City skyline, but just New York City as a whole, all the way going past Staten Island, and you can even see New Jersey from up there. Of course, this place is packed with tourists, because obviously one of the biggest tourist attractions in the entire city, but don't let that stop you. There's a lot of people doing some interesting stuff up there. You know, I'm making a YouTube video, there's tourists getting Instagram content. There's even professional photographers up there doing wedding shoots. This one was pretty cool. All right, so the strategy was simple. Basically, I was gonna load my camera, find a spot, and just not move. Because up there, the moment you move, people swoop in and take your spot, and I couldn't have that because I was trying to get golden hour and into, you know, the blue hour as well.
You think we're gonna get a spot for sunset? It's
Hope
gonna get
so.
crazy over there. At least we don't need to be tethered on like a tripod or anything, but we're gonna have to get a little pushy. Okay, this is officially
Thing
on
looks
now.
huge.
Yeah, this thing's fucking ridiculous. All right, how do I open it though? That's the question.
One last thing to note, up there, there's two different ways to see the view. One is through glass and one is without any glass at all. Unfortunately, the area where there was no glass and it's just kind of an open air view was packed, and we kind of missed our cut to jump in there and establish our spot. So we found a different spot where there was glass, but there are these little openings between the glass. So the plan was to stick the lens through the opening and get all the photos. Unfortunately, the Fuji lens is massive, so it didn't fit through the gap in the glass, but it allowed me to get pretty close. You'll kind of see the results of this later. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best.
All right, arrow is aligned. Camera is sealed. Come closer. And let's see, we get it to number 1. We gotta wind on forever on this thing. Okay, all right, we're at number 1 here.
I can't see the whole get up.
Back up for a second.
Yeah, this is a massive. Oh, sorry. It's a huge camera. I mean, I got like 3 in my hands.
So here it is. This is the crazy view from up there, and we got incredible conditions. We had clouds, we had beautiful golden hour. It was calm, it wasn't too windy up there. It was just amazing. Homie Brian shoots a lot of film, but he also shoots a lot of digital, and he's got this massive Fuji GX6. I think that's what it's called. It's the digital camera with like 100 megapixel sensor, medium format. So brought that obviously because it's a lot cheaper to use that once you own the camera than to keep buying film. The shots look pretty cool. Here's the view of all the tourists during peak golden hour. It's pretty crazy. Honestly, the nighttime shots here are just as impressive as the golden hour. It's just incredible. And if you can catch that early blue hour where you still have some of the color in the sky, but the building lights are also on, it's a pretty remarkable view all across the board.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So that was fun. I highly recommend you all go rent cameras, and that way you can try things that you've never tried before, especially cameras like the GX617. So yeah, that was fantastic, and I'm glad I did it. That camera's very quirky, but I think at my experience level now shooting on film, especially having tried things like 4x5, you can kind of go through the paces of shooting a camera like that and get really usable results. My issues weren't due to user error, I would say, or at least not camera user error, but of course, deciding to point my camera through the opening in the glass is ultimately what led to me having that blurry effect on both sides, where you can actually see the edges of the glass that was in front of me, even though I was shooting through the middle of the opening. The camera lens is just that wide, and it produces that extremely wide image. So anything that's in front of you anywhere is gonna make it into that photo. Even if you use the 180mm lens that I use, which I think is the tightest lens they have. Even with that lens, you still get all of that stuff in your image. So here we're comparing the negatives. This right here is the 6x17 negative, and this right here are two 6x9 negatives. You can pretty clearly see that this 6x17 negative is just humongous, and it's the size of basically two 6x9 negatives if you kind of count for the space here in between the two shots. So just looking at the negatives here, a couple things I want to point out. Obviously these are light leaks right here. Not exactly sure why, but only happen in those two spots. These images are completely fine. And these negatives are beautiful. This is from the Zeiss Icon Netter, and just very dense negatives, beautiful sharp images. They could be probably a tad sharper, but I shot this handheld. So that's probably why there's a hint of kind of motion blur, but just a hint. If you zoom into these images, you'll see that they're definitely sharp enough. Looking at the 6x17 negatives here, there's a myriad of issues with mine. So I think there's two key things to point out. Well, three. First and foremost, as I mentioned here about the glass, that blurry kind of stuff you see here, that's due to the actual glass, the physical glass that was in front of me at the top of the rock. The section that I took the photos at had glass panels with space in between. So I put my lens in between, but the Fuji lens is just so big that, first of all, it didn't fit through the gap, but then also it's so wide that it captured the blurriness here of the glass. The glass was basically in the foreground and out of focus, and therefore gave you just a hint of that soft blur. And it kind of, I wouldn't say it ruined the shot, but it definitely, made it not perfect. So that's happening in basically every shot. Maybe a little less in some than others, but definitely present everywhere. The other thing that we see here are light leaks. So these are very clear right here. You can see up there, up there. I think the images themselves tend to be slightly fogged as well. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first reason is perhaps the camera itself, where the lens board meets the actual lens. I didn't tighten that properly, and therefore some light was leaking through. I don't think that was the case, but clearly something happened. The other thing I want to mention is that I actually developed these at home in my bathroom, and my new bathroom here in New York isn't 100% light tight because the door faces the living room where all the windows are. So I did that when I probably shouldn't have in terms of the time of day, and some light was leaking through there, and I moved quickly, but I think that light may have actually resulted in fogging up this film and giving me those hard kind of light leaks. And if that's the case, that's 100% my fault and pretty stupid, in fact, because it's easy to avoid. But I did buy a changing bag now, but I hate the changing bag. It's so annoying. Your hands get sweaty in it, and every time you're messing around with the negatives, you know, the humidity in there starts to build up, and then it gets really hard to actually roll the negative or the film itself through the spool to get it into the container. Changing bag is terrible. So I think what I'm gonna do is just stick to developing film at nighttime, where my bathroom is very dark, and because it's dark outside and I turn off all the lights, there is no light leaking through the actual cracks in the door. But yeah, nonetheless, still very happy with these negatives, and they're just stunning and dramatic. Only thing I'm thinking about now is what this would look like on slide film. Just imagine this in a positive image with these crazy colors. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, of course, click that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the video. All right, y'all, until the next one, I'm out.